So let's talk about the new Space Marine rules for the drop pod. With their updated datasheet, they can now transport 12 models, and you can charge out of them once again. To me, they're looking improved compared with the previous, though how much so I think is a matter of debate. Let's talk through their rules and a few tempting things to put inside them. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking drop pods. In this video I thought we'd do an overview of their updated datasheets that Games Workshop have issued for the Astartes via their digital download. Drop pods are really quite iconic to the Space Marine way of war. Once they arrive on their battle barges, they need to get planetside. If there's time and a more coordinated landing, they might take a bunch of Thunderhawks or Storm Ravens, but when the Battle Brothers need to get straight to the fighting with no time at all, drop pods could be the tool for the job. Performing precision deep strikes into the enemy lines, the pods basically fired at the planet, screaming through the atmosphere and employing some powerful thrusters to slow them down just before impact so they don't just explode on entry. The doors fly open and a whole bunch of angry Astartes get out to start purging the enemy. Maybe good for precision raids on enemy bases behind the lines, or to cause chaos or establish a perimeter somewhere within a field of battle itself. The Astartes commonly hold prayers or battle rituals on the way down, and if a normal mortal tried to ride in one, they'd likely be destroyed by the G-forces. Recently, Games Workshop updated the drop pod model. The updated version has had some mixed reception, though that was absolutely certainly true of the previous one. It was kind of well known for being a pain to both assemble and paint, needing to have a bit of five-way symmetry as you glued the things together, and with a whole bunch of moving parts, so you might need some rubber bands and things to hold it into place. And it is really quite labour intensive to paint as well, lots of inside surfaces and outside ones. I must admit I sunk a whole bunch of hours into one of mine that isn't in danger of getting finished anytime soon. It did seem highly likely the drop pod would get a resculpt at some point, too iconic to be removed from the setting, but at some point likely to get a Primaris scale update, and Games Workshop decided to do that and release it alongside the Space Wolves, making a few changes to the models on the way. On this one, the doors are basically always modelled down, so basically representing it after it's made impact, with some optional rodable that you can put around it. There's no auto weapon like a Stormbolt or anything like that, and maybe the hull just made a little bit more chunky to accommodate those Primaris perhaps. The kit does look significantly easier to build from these sprue pictures, not having to line up 5 things at once, but they haven't really made too many big changes to the model design really. Here's a top-down view of it. If you put the extra rubble on it, it does increase the footprint by quite a serious amount, and it's already quite big. For criticisms of it, a few people found it kind of sad that for this one you're not able to open and close the doors anymore, maybe removing a little bit of the sort of dynamic storytelling from the model, though I feel like it did have trade-offs with making it a bit easier to make. Games Workshop also chose to package 2 of them in a box as well, which I feel like has some positives and negatives. The price is £50, €65 or $80, and it does mean that you're not able just to pick up one drop pod on its own without going to third parties or something, but on the other hand the money per drop pod is less than it was previously. I think previously they were around about £34 per drop pod, and now they're $25 I guess, so if you were potentially in the market for more than one of them, they have got cheaper by that mark. In any case, if you're looking to pick up some drop pods, check out the channel affiliate discount retailers linked down in the video description. They can save a bit of money versus Games Workshop if you do happen to pick up any models through them. And if you use the links down below, a small amount of money goes to help support Auspex Tactics if you pick up anything through it. A big thank you to anyone using those. Wargame Portal in the USA has 15% off, and I believe they've currently got a fairly good supply of drop pods up for pre-order if you happen to live in the USA. Let's get into the rules though, and for a datasheet that works in a fairly similar way, they have made perhaps a surprising amount of minor changes, some of which are buffs and nerfs, and some of them make sense from either a gameplay point of view or a theme point of view, where others maybe don't so much. The base cost of the drop pod remains unchanged. It's still 70 points, essentially to buy Deep Strike for a Space Marine unit to hurtle into battle, so it is still going to be paying quite a premium compared with just say buying those squads and either fielding them on foot to march up the board, or if you want them to arrive from reserves they could go in strategic reserve and arrive from the edges of the table turn 2. As ever with these, it's going to be more efficient for pricier squads and maxed out transports, though now you can fit some pricier units in it as its transport capacity has been upgraded. On the keywords front, it's gained the dedicated transport keyword. Previously it was just a transport vehicle but not a dedicated one, and that means that if you want a full-on force of Space Marine drop pods, then you're able to a bit more now. You can have 6 of them in a 2,000 point list if you really want to go heavy on them. Probably wouldn't be a good idea from any sort of big competitive gameplay point of view, but could be fun I suppose. And it also means that you can't just run them completely empty as well. So if you wanted just to drop them down for utility or annoyance purposes for some reason, if you do that then they'd be destroyed, as dedicated transports need to have something start inside them. For their base defensive stat lines, they remain fairly similar. 8 wounds at toughness 7 with a 3+ save. They at least take a bit of firepower to take down. They won't just fold over to a few small arms, but they're not really particularly tanky for a 70-point model. Maybe more or less what you'd expect from them. Then for their way that they get into battle, they deploy via Deep Strike. They must start in reserves, they've got no option to be set up on the tabletop, and when they're deployed on the board, they don't move at all. They've got a movement characteristic of dash, not even 0 inches. The new drop pod datasheet lost its shooting attack, so it no longer mounts an automatic Stormbolter or Deathwind missile launcher, which could previously take aim at some close targets with the Machine Spirit, I guess. Maybe losing a tiny bit of fun factor there, though I feel like the main appeal of it was just to transport Space Marines into battle, and that wasn't exactly a make or break. It is kind of weird that it gets Oath of Moment on its datasheet rule, despite having no ranged or melee attack. One of the most interesting things about the new datasheet is an actual diagram for marking out the hull of the drop pod, what counts as that and what doesn't. It seems kind of rare that Games Workshop do actual diagrams based on models, but they've chosen to for this one. And basically it looks like neither the rubble nor the unfurled doors are counted as part of the hull, but the central pentagonal bit is. So that's where you measure ranges and disembarking from it, and other models will be able to freely move over the unfurled doors, counting them just as part of the battlefield, I suppose. Despite that where you measure from, you'd still need to be able to physically set it up when you put it down, and the drop pod with those unfurled doors does have a pretty enormous footprint. It could make it kind of awkward to set up if there's a bunch of narrow terrain that's too near it. There's going to be some areas where it just couldn't go, and it does feel like that could be a big weakness on certain battlefields. You might have places where the pod might theoretically be able to set up due to the range near enemy units, but not be able to because there's just physically no room for it. You could maybe make some allowances in more casual games, but it probably feels like it's going to be one of the models that's going to be annoyingly practically limited for more competitive ones. Finally, the other change for its core stat line is that it's OC0 now. Previously, it kind of weirdly had OC2, which felt kind of odd for an uncrewed vehicle, meaning that you could potentially use it as a deep striker to do certain utility things like secondary objectives and doing actions. Now it's basically going to have very limited impact on objective type things. I guess the pod itself could be used for a behind enemy lines thing if they leave really quite a big gap for it. Or you could use it as an engage on all front things, though I guess often the unit that's jumping out of it would equally be able to do those if it's dropping in. I'm really not too surprised to see it drop down to OC0 when they took a second look at its rules though. As for the exciting bit though, and that's the Space Marines that you put inside, as mentioned the transport capacity has weirdly been expanded to 12, despite it very clearly having 10 slots inside it. This follows quite a lot of transport things in 10th edition where they basically expanded it from 10 models up to 12 to allow you to have some attached characters within the same transport, which I thought was really quite a good quality of lifestyle thing, as otherwise you had very awkward things with numbers and certain units not being able to attach properly to each other. The drop pod was something that hadn't happened for though, just because there's very clearly 10 seats. It is a pretty big deal for gameplay purposes though, means that you could have 10 Hellblasters jump out led by a lieutenant, rather than having to awkwardly play with understrength units and drop down a Hellblaster, which I think was at least a fairly big deal for unit efficiency, if you're having to basically bin off an extra 22 points worth of model just to use them in this format. As for the other transport restrictions, you can't transport Centurions, Gravis, Drum Pack, Wolfen or Terminators, no change here. And it was one of the transports that didn't care about the Tacticus keyword and Primaris already. You could already still use it for things like Devastators and Hellblasters equally. And you can put multiple small units in one pod. You could say have 3 units of 3 Blade Guard jump out of it, each one of an attached character now. Or hark back to older editions and have multiple units of Devastators jump out. Overall a bit of a weird one, that one. I can see why they do it for gameplay purposes. I feel like for other transports it's maybe a bit easier to fudge the numbers as you don't really know exactly how many could fit within the hold. I've seen various people comment things like, I just presume that the Space Marines are sitting in each other's laps for a couple of them. A couple are holding on to the outside of the pod for dear life, or the last 2 get stacked in the middle of it where the guns used to go. Whichever creative shapes they use to fit 12 Marines in any case the main purpose is to drop them down and they can arrive any time in battle rounds 1 to 3, turning up in your reinforcement step of your movement phase, and regardless of any mission rules. Basically the big draw here being that they can deep strike turn 1, which most things can't do, and the most obvious use for that is to deliver a shooting alpha strike. With some fairly godly positioning you should be able to just put them down on the board and lay into one enemy unit turn 1 before the opponents had any chance to do anything about it. Once the pod's deployed, they must get out within 3 inches of the pod measured from the hull. They still have to set up greater than 9 inches away from enemy models, so they can't use it for a super close charge or anything like that. And throughout the rest of the game you can't strap yourself back into the pod. It's basically no longer used as a transport vehicle after that, as more sort of sitting there just as some battlefield debris and screening out some deep strikes and things versus the opponent until they get around to clearing it. Finally, one of the other bigger updates is that you can charge out of a drop pod now. You often were able to do this in the past, but with the new 10th edition transport rules that wasn't able to be a thing, as by arriving from deep strike the drop pod counts as having moved. Now though they're explicitly able to, so it means that your Space Marines will be able to jump out of the pod. If they deploy as close as possible then they should have a 9-inch charge on the enemy, which is usually around about a 27% chance, so a 1 in 4 chance to get in, going up to almost a 1 in 2 chance. If you budget a command point reroll for them, I feel like it's really quite an interesting thing that they are able to do that again. It definitely does add value, but it certainly doesn't add any sort of reliable value, as most of the time, even if you throw a command point at it, they're still not going to get into melee, so it's going to be a kind of win big, lose big thing there. Overall, between all that, it's basically a premium deep strike option for Space Marine units. It can arrive turn 1 and get a shooting alpha strike. The unit or units that jumped out can still charge, and then from there it's not going to have too much impact on the game besides screening out some enemy deep strikes, and will just sit around until the opponent decides to destroy it. Being in a mobile vehicle might occasionally have some downsides as well, potentially letting enemy infantry units hide in melee with it so you can't shoot them so well. For trying to get the most efficiency out of it, I feel like two things kind of stand out to me. I feel like you're usually going to need to arrive turn 1 to really justify it versus other options. I strongly suspect that it's usually going to be the sort of thing that makes sense just to have one of as opposed to more due to diminishing returns. For the deep strike thing, I just don't think that adding essentially deep strike in a kind of clunky way with a big model that might have some limited setup capacity is going to be worth 70 points if you're coming down turn 2 or later. And if you were going down that kind of route, then there's multiple other good options. You could just have the unit advance into the mid board and then move up again. That's going to give you lots of movement without spending any points, and you'd be able to reach a good amount of the board. There's plenty of units that just have normal deep strike anyway. I feel like most of them tend to be more efficient buying a unit that doesn't have it and then buying them a pod, at least when it's 70 points. You could be getting a whole bunch of Inceptors, for example. And if you do want some reserves arrival things, you could just use strategic reserves completely for free, maybe even using rapid ingress with them. And that could be another way to get shooting alpha strike things on the board. You'd probably also be considering other transport vehicles as well, paying more for like a Land Raider or a Repulsor. In general, I think if you are taking a drop pod, you probably want to be thinking about trying to use it turn 1. Otherwise, I do think it's more likely to have kind of diminishing returns if you have more than one of them. You are paying quite a big premium for early arrival that isn't actually going to do any damage of its own. That'll give some of your units the power to strike an enemy unit first, and they'll hit the single most optimal targets that's going to be the most value to you. Having a second drop pod doing the same thing, it's going to be by nature less value, as it's going to be going after the second most optimal targets. Maybe that's not a bad thing if you're playing on a game with some very low terrain levels. You might actually have a fair few options, but if you are playing on a board that's got lots of terrain, you might not have many choices. If you're going first, the opponent might still be able to hide the vast majority of their army, even from drop pod strike. And if they're going first, they might be able to zone you out in a big way, move all their units up so your drop pods are dropping back and not quite so effective. For those reasons, I'd be more tempted to run 1 than 2, which might not be the best fit with Games Workshop trying to sell 2 of them to you in a box, I guess. Not saying that you couldn't use more for fun factor, but I suspect if trying to build strong lists, then that'd be what I'd be tempted by. For contents for what to put in them, there's really quite a lot of options in the Space Marine army. When buying expensive transport though, I feel like you're going to be pushed to things that deal a lot of damage and a high value. It's just not going to make a lot of sense to use these on cheaper units that aren't quite so much threat. We might well have just been better off just taking more of those units to begin with and then walking them into position. Maybe for the single most obvious general Space Marine combo, 10 Hellblasters with a Lieutenant is really quite nice general purpose firepower. With Oath of Moment on their targets, they're going to absolutely obliterate one thing. They are pricey though, at a big 285 points, kind of to the point where they're not really frequently seen on competitive tables, at least not for standard Astartes, even if they're certainly not unplayable. I'd likely weigh them up against putting them in a repulsor for this maybe. Otherwise, the Librarius Conclave could be interesting. It could be a way to deliver the 10 Stone Guard plus a Fusilier Librarian combo. No need to drop any models for this now if putting them in a drop pod, so a much more viable option versus a repulsor than it was before. We could even have multiple lead Devastator squads, say 5 models plus a Librarian in it, and have some pretty devastating shooting alpha strike turn up exactly where you need it there. Maybe other options could be things like an Infernus squad with Vulcan Hestan attached. As before though, I think you'd still be tempted to put 10 Infernus Marines in the pod and just have Vulcan elsewhere, maybe with some company heroes just marking the target, as he doesn't necessarily need to be in the unit. For the more divergent chapters, I feel like most of them maybe aren't quite so interested in drop pods. Most of them tend to focus a bit more on melee versus range. I guess maybe you could do things like Dark Angels with Azrael and 10 Hellblasters in a drop pod. That would stop him farming his command point on the first battle round though if he's off the board. Otherwise, Deathwatch units can shoot fairly hard, but at the same time they've got access to easy deep strike shenanigans with their Teleportarium, so paying an extra 70 points for just getting that deep strike 1 turn early seems a bit questionable. Besides ranged units, having things charge out of it is now at least possible, so in theory you could put a whole bunch of Blade Guard veterans in it, or maybe some Inner Circle Companions, Sword Brethren or Death Company. I feel like it's definitely quite a cool idea. The drop pod slams into the board and then they make a charge on the enemy's front line, but there just doesn't really seem to be any good way to actually make that charge very likely to actually happen. Realistically, if you load one up with melee units, best case scenario is that you drop it 9 inches away. The units have to stay 9 inches away, so they've got a 9-inch charge to make into the enemy units, potentially not even against particularly optimal ones if the opponent's screening and no doubt sees this coming. And then the vast majority of Space Marine units out there are likely to fail that charge, even if you spend a command point reroll on it, which could be a command point wasted, and then basically your fancy melee units that paid a big premium for the drop pod delivery just sit there out in the open and then get gunned down. Even if you manage to maybe drop them somewhere safe in a ruin and then attempt that 9-inch charge, it still feels like the overall thing's been a little bit questionable. Sure, they've had a low chance to make a charge on the first turn, but on the other hand, if they have wound up needing to charge on the second turn instead, you might have been better off with another transport like, say, an Impulsor or something else. Space Marines in general don't have an enormous amount of charge buffs that give them an extra X inches to their charge. If there were more things that gave you, say, a +2 to charge, then there'd be more interesting things from the drop pod. Off the top of my head, I guess Dark Angel's Deathwing could get a +2 inch to charge against things that are in melee with Raven Wing. That requires even more setup though, and you could already make pretty good use of that with Deathwing Knights, so it doesn't seem efficient. There's a few things that allow you to re-roll charge rolls, but those just do something that a command point reroll could have done anyway, and still leaves you odds on not to make the charge. If trying to get Space Marines into the fight, they're definitely going to have rivalry with other transports. I feel like in general the drop pod probably is going to be better at getting the Space Marines right into battle and delivering shooting combos more reliably, but do provide less value beyond that. You basically got 70 points for a unit that's less tough than an Impulsor, doesn't have any OC, doesn't have any damage output, and doesn't have the potential for delivering units to melee quite as reliably. That definitely sees some play for some combo units, maybe things like hybrid threats like Captains with Stern Guard, or Captains with Assault Intercessors in Blood Angels, or Sword Brethren for Black Templars. I guess it does have a smaller transport capacity, it was kind of rarely used for ranged threats. The other competitor for delivering big scary shooting combos though, maybe like that Hellblaster one, is the Repulsor. That's significantly more points, so a big 110 more, but does have its advantages in being really quite a big intimidating battle tank, with lots of damage and defense of its own right, plus that handy re-embarked rule versus charges which adds some more value for a transport point of view. Talking of transport though, they might have some good use for the Firestorm Assault Force. That could be one way to get units within 12-inch range for the +1 strength buff that they get. Maybe nice for Infernus Marines, potentially some other stuff too. And there is that stratagem for +1 to hit after getting out of a transport, though that will be having some rivalry with the +1 to wound one. In any case, overall between all that, I would say that the drop pods have probably improved as a datasheet overall. Certainly pre-update, I never really saw anyone taking them in any sort of optimised or competitive style Space Marine lists, though to me it doesn't really feel like they've got worse. The main things they've lost are going down to OC0, which is genuinely a bit annoying for secondary style things. Losing the gun feels kind of neither here nor there, it's not really what you took them for. But on the other hand, they have got better in two really quite big ways. The 12 model transport capacity does allow you some more threatening and more efficient unit combos embarked. And then the thing that I value the option to charge for is more for additional value from a ranged unit that you've dropped down. At least in theory, you've got a unit that comes down, drops the ranged unit out, it shoots something hard, and then after that, previously, you'd basically have no option to charge, so you're just sitting back and taking the enemy attacks next turn. Even with a small chance to get into melee 1 out of every 4 times, or about half the time with a command reroll, that's still going to do something sometimes. You might have a whole bunch of Hellblasters, punch down enemy extra screening units. It might be quite good for hybrid style threats, maybe Stern Guard with some sort of character attached. They can really hit legitimately hard in melee versus the Oath of Moment targets. I more see it as an unreliable, potentially really quite big extra value add. You just accept that most of the time isn't going to do anything. Overall, at first impressions, I still not really expect them to see them too often in strong lists. I think at 70 points they're still a bit borderline, and that enormous footprint and being hard to deploy could limit them in tight terrain setups. But particularly with transport capacity and an unreliable charge chance for delivering big shooting combos in less optimised games, they seem pretty usable. I'm sure there'll be a bunch of people trying them out with their new models and getting them on the board. Let me know your thoughts on the drop pod though. What do you make of the new datasheet, and what would you be tempted to put in them, if anything? Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. As mentioned, if you are looking to pick up some Space Marine drop pods or anything else, feel free to check out the links down in the video description to save a bit of money versus Games Workshop. 15% off in the USA from Wargame Portal, 16% in the EU from Taschengeldeep, and 15% off in the UK from Element Games, amongst others. I'll leave this one there for now though. If you've been enjoying the channel, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support the channel more directly, as well as those discount links in the video description, there's also the Patreon page for the channel. Channel patrons get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, an automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.